The 1970s shimmered with disco balls, bell-bottom jeans, and the blaring of electric guitars. But amid the noise of the era, there was one voice that stood out not for its volume, but for its softness. A velvet whisper of melancholy, a voice that could hush a room and send chills through a crowd of thousands. That voice belonged to Karen Carpenter. When she first sang, time seemed to pause. There was something haunting, tender, and deeply intimate about her voice. It wasn't just technically beautiful, it felt. It was the voice of someone who had seen pain, even before the world saw her suffer. Karen and her brother Richard made up the Carpenters, a duo that became one of the most successful American musical acts of the 1970s. But while their music sold millions and earned them Grammy Awards, behind closed doors, Karen was fighting a battle invisible to most, a battle that would eventually take her life. This is not just the story of Karen Carpenter's rise and fall. This is the story of the weight she carried, the story of how someone so seemingly perfect on stage could be unraveling behind it. And as new revelations emerge, hidden diaries, long-suppressed interviews, and heartbreaking admissions from those closest to her, the tragedy becomes even more profound. Karen Ann Carpenter was born on March 2, 1950, in New Haven, Connecticut. Her early years were relatively quiet. Her family was close-knit, traditional, and working class. Her father Harold was calm and quiet. Her mother Agnes strong, strict, and unrelentingly ambitious. Agnes Carpenter had always wanted a star in the family. At first, that ambition was projected onto Karen's older brother, Richard. He was the musical prodigy, the one she saw as destined for greatness. Karen was just the little girl who tagged along. But in silence, Karen was absorbing everything. She loved listening to music, especially Les Paul, Ella Fitzgerald, and Perry Como. And though Richard was immersed in classical piano, Karen was drawn to rhythm. She wanted to feel the music in her bones. Her parents moved the family to Downey, California, in 1963, chasing better opportunities for Richard's musical career. But the West Coast changed Karen. At Downey High School, she joined the marching band playing drums, not singing, not yet. She practiced for hours a day, becoming one of the few female drummers in her school's history. When she sang for the first time in public, it wasn't planned. She was 16. Richard had formed a jazz trio, and during one practice session, she casually sang "I'll Be Yours." Everyone stopped. Even Richard was stunned. Her voice was warm, dark, and rich beyond her years. It didn't soar. It cradled. It wasn't forceful. It invited. Karen wasn't meant to be the star. But her voice didn't care about plans. By 1969, the Carpenters had signed with A&M Records. They were young, clean-cut, and different from the psychedelic explosion dominating the airwaves. Their music was melodic, soft, and almost melancholic. It shouldn't have worked, but it did wildly. They Longed to Be Close to You hit #1. Then We've Only Just Begun. Soon, Karen's voice was everywhere on radios, in grocery stores, echoing from bedroom windows. They were the safe alternative in a time of rebellion. Some called it elevator music. But the truth, people craved something gentle amid the chaos. Karen was just 20 years old, but she was suddenly America's sweetheart. Yet fame came with a price. Interviews, tours, performances, photo shoots. It never stopped. And in the middle of it all was Karen, barely eating, smiling politely, and pushing down the growing storm inside her. Behind that smile was someone who was beginning to disappear. Weight had always been a subject of scrutiny, even long before it became a health crisis. Her mother, Agnes, often compared her to other girls, encouraging her to stay thin. The media didn't help. Critics commented on her body more than her music. One reviewer casually wrote, "She sings beautifully but looks chunky next to Richard." Karen, read those words. In public, she shrugged them off. In private, she began controlling her food, skipping meals, secretly vomiting, counting calories down to the last speck of lettuce. At first, no one noticed. She was just watching her weight, they said. But by 1975, Karen had become a shadow of herself. Her once round face became gaunt. Her arms were skeletal. Her performance gowns hung loose. Richard, immersed in his own addiction to Quaaludes, didn't see the full extent. Their managers dismissed it. Her mother told her she looked better thinner. But behind the curtain, Karen was fading. Literally. In 1976, the Carpenters cancelled a European tour. The official statement blamed exhaustion. The truth, Karen could no longer walk without assistance. Her weight had plummeted to under 90 pounds. She was dying, and no one was stopping the show. In 1981, Karen made a bold move, her first solo album. She wanted to break free from Richard's control, from the image, from the sound that was no longer hers. She recorded it with Phil Ramone in New York, exploring more mature themes: love, heartbreak, even sensuality. But when she played it for her family and Richard, the reaction was cold. Her mother hated it. Richard called it un-Carpenter-like. The album was shelved, unreleased. Karen was devastated. It was her voice, her truth, and they silenced it. Afterward, she plunged deeper into her eating disorder. But this time, she tried to fight back. She entered therapy. She sought medical help. She even spoke quietly about her struggles in private circles. But anorexia in the early 80s was barely understood. Doctors treated her as a psychological case, not a medical emergency. In 1983, she collapsed in her bedroom. Her heart, weakened by years of malnutrition, had simply stopped. She was just 32 years old. The world mourned. Radio stations played Rainy Days and Mondays. Fans wept. Celebrities paid tribute. But behind the grief was guilt. Karen had been begging to be seen, and no one had really looked. By the mid-1970s, Karen's weight obsession had turned into full-blown anorexia, a term most people hadn't even heard of yet. To the public, she was the picture of beauty and elegance. But beneath her carefully tailored gowns, her body was failing. She began every morning with laxatives and black coffee. She weighed herself constantly, sometimes 5 to 10 times a day. She didn't trust scales in hotels or studios. She brought her own. Her calorie intake hovered under 500 a day. Lettuce, celery, sometimes nothing. But the sickness wasn't just in her diet. It was in her mind. No matter how thin she became, the mirror showed her someone bigger, someone she despised, and the applause only made it worse. The thinner she got, the more the media praised her new look. Friends complimented her discipline. No one knew they were applauding her slow suicide. Karen's home life was complicated. Her mother, Agnes, was a powerful figure in her life. She was not abusive in the way we often imagine. There were no bruises or shouting matches, but the control ran deep, emotional, constant, subtle. Agnes favored Richard. That was no secret. Even in interviews, she would beam with pride when talking about his music, his gifts, his dedication. Karen, she was the pretty one, the polite one, the lucky one to be singing her brother's songs. Karen ached for her mother's validation. She never got it. Even when Karen became the group's center, the voice that made them legends, Agnes still treated her like the supporting act. In family photos, she stood beside Richard. Karen stood behind. When Karen tried to make her solo album in 1979, she hoped it would finally earn her mother's respect. It was bold. It was personal. She worked with Phil Ramone, the legendary producer behind Billy Joel and Paul Simon. The album had groove. It had maturity. It had Karen. But when she played it for her family back in Downey, the room went cold. Agnes hated it. "This isn't who you are," she said. "Where are the nice ballads?" Richard was even harsher. "This doesn't sound like the Carpenters." Karen was heartbroken. The album, titled simply Karen Carpenter, was shelved by A&M Records after pressure from her family and management. It wouldn't be released until 1996, 13 years after her death. By now, the Carpenters were a brand. Clean, wholesome, safe. But maintaining that image was exhausting. Karen was told what to wear, how to sit in interviews, when to smile, and how to appear ladylike. Her laugh, deep and brassy, was discouraged in public. Her opinions were too strong. She was told to let Richard talk. Even her drum playing was reduced on stage because it wasn't feminine. She was being erased in her own spotlight, and yet she performed tirelessly. Every tour, every photo shoot, every awards show, Karen showed up. Even when her weight dropped below 90 pounds, even when she could barely stay conscious backstage, she kept performing. One tour, doctor later admitted, "She was the sickest person I've ever seen walk on stage." But when the curtain rose, she gave everything she had. And still, it was never enough. Karen dreamed of a family, a home, a love that would rescue her from the emptiness behind the applause. She dated a few celebrities, Steve Martin, Tony Danza, even Mark Harmon, but none of the relationships stuck. She often fell for emotionally unavailable men, older men, men who didn't understand the depths of her self-doubt. Then came Thomas James Burris, a real estate developer she met in 1980. He was charming, polished, confident. He gave her the attention and protection she craved. Within a few months, they were engaged. Everyone in Karen's circle was stunned. She barely knew him. But Karen was 30. Her friends were settling down. She was tired of waiting. The wedding was lavish. Karen wore a designer gown, smiled for cameras, and played the part of a glowing bride. But behind the scenes, her family was uneasy. Richard hated Burris. He seemed opportunistic, flashy, and emotionally cold. They were right. Within weeks, Karen discovered the truth. Burris had lied. He'd had a vasectomy and didn't want children, a deal-breaker. For Karen, who dreamed of motherhood, he was also in debt and living beyond his means. Soon, he began verbally abusing her, calling her fat and worthless. He humiliated her at parties, berated her in private. Karen begged her lawyer for a divorce less than a year after the wedding. By 1981, Karen was unraveling. She'd become addicted to ipecac syrup, an over-the-counter emetic that induced vomiting. It was meant for poisoning victims. Karen used it daily to purge even the tiniest meals. Her heart began to falter. Her blood pressure dropped. Her skin turned grey. Her hair thinned. She entered therapy with Stephen Levenkron, a specialist in anorexia nervosa, and moved to New York to begin recovery. Levenkron did his best, but at the time, anorexia was still considered a psychological oddity, not a life-threatening illness. Karen showed some progress. She gained a few pounds, wrote letters to friends saying she felt hopeful again. But the damage to her body was already irreversible. In late 1982, she returned to California, moving into her parents' home while her divorce from Burris was being finalized. On the surface, she seemed better, happier, even. She began recording again. She went shopping with friends. She started picking out furniture for her new apartment. But inside, her heart literally and emotionally was giving out. In January 1983, Karen attended a dinner with Dionne Warwick and other friends. She wore a red blouse and a new pair of slacks. She smiled, she laughed, but her body was visibly frail. That night, she confessed to Dionne that she'd started using ipecac again. She couldn't stop. The fear of gaining weight still haunted her. "I see a fat girl in the mirror," she whispered. A few days later, she called Richard. They talked for over an hour. She told him she was sorry, that she was tired, that she wanted to make music again, real music. It would be the last time they spoke. On February 4, 1983, Karen woke up early. She was due to finalize her divorce papers that morning. Her new apartment was nearly ready. She had plans to record new tracks in the spring. She walked into her closet and collapsed. Her mother found her unconscious, cold on the floor in a fetal position. Her heart had stopped. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead at Downey Community Hospital at 9:51 a.m. Karen Carpenter was 32 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest due to emetine toxicity, the active ingredient in ipecac syrup. Her heart had simply given out. She had fought so hard, but the mirror had won. From the outside, Karen's marriage to real estate developer Thomas Burris looked like a fairy tale. The wedding on August 31, 1980, at the Beverly Hills Hotel was grand, attended by celebrities, musicians, and old Hollywood names. Karen wore a satin gown with beaded sleeves, her brown eyes glowing under soft lighting. But the truth was darker than the photographs suggested. Karen had only known Tom for a few months. They met through mutual friends at a charity event. He was tall, polished, 39 years old, and spoke with confidence. Karen was vulnerable, tired of dating men who didn't take her seriously. Tom seemed like a man who would protect her, a man who could take control so she wouldn't have to. She fell fast, too fast. Within weeks they were engaged. Richard and Agnes were horrified. Burris hadn't been properly vetted. But Karen was stubborn. For once, she was going to make a decision on her own. She told Richard to stay out of it. Her mother, surprisingly, said little, but red flags were everywhere. Just days before the wedding, Karen found out Tom had undergone a vasectomy, something he had never told her. She wanted children more than anything. She confronted him in tears, begging to postpone the wedding. He refused. He told her she was being dramatic, that she'd change her mind. Karen went ahead with it anyway, too ashamed to call it off. It was the beginning of the end. The marriage deteriorated quickly. Burris, it turned out, was in serious debt. His business had been failing for years, and he was using Karen's fame and finances to maintain his lifestyle. He borrowed money, took over her bank accounts. He even tried to get her to sign over property deeds. Worse than the financial betrayal was the emotional one. Tom didn't understand Karen's eating disorder. He mocked her, called her disgusting during meals, and accused her of being too weak to be a real woman. He insulted her appearance in front of others. Friends recalled Karen showing up at events with forced smiles, clinging to him nervously, her voice quieter than usual. He isolated her, emotionally abused her, and she let it happen for a while because she couldn't bear the humiliation of a failed marriage. But in private, she was unraveling. Karen had always been closer to her father, Harold Carpenter, quiet and gentle. He adored her, but he rarely stood up to Agnes. When Karen cried at the dinner table over being ignored, Harold would lower his eyes. When she begged for his support on her solo album, he simply said, "Ask your mother." Agnes, meanwhile, had grown colder. She viewed the marriage as a stain on the family's clean image. Rather than comfort Karen, she criticized her for rushing into things. When Karen moved back home after separating from Tom, her mother barely spoke to her. Karen once wrote in a diary, "I could win a Grammy and Mum would still say, I should have smiled more on TV." She never stopped trying to please her. By late 1981, Karen was desperate. Her weight was at its lowest. She had sunken cheeks, thinning hair, and severe muscle weakness. Her once luminous skin had turned sallow. Her heartbeat had slowed to a dangerous level. She couldn't climb stairs without fainting. Her hands trembled. Her voice was barely audible in the studio. She checked into Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, where she met Stephen Levenkran, one of the only doctors in America treating anorexia seriously. He was kind, calm, and genuinely wanted to help. Karen stayed in New York for months, attending therapy and undergoing nutrition plans, and for a while, she got better. She gained nearly 30 pounds. Her cheeks began to fill out. She wore brighter colors. Her friends said she laughed more. She even started making future plans music, furniture shopping, apartment hunting. But underneath the surface, she was terrified. Karen hadn't gained the weight naturally. Doctors had used intravenous feeding and a high-calorie regimen that her body wasn't prepared for. The rapid change shocked her heart. Her metabolism had slowed so drastically that reintroducing food too quickly caused dangerous chemical imbalances. It's now known as refeeding syndrome, a condition that can cause sudden heart failure in anorexia patients. But in the early 1980s, it was barely understood. Karen, unaware, thought she was healing. She believed she was finally going to live. Just a few weeks before her death, Karen finally filed for divorce. Her lawyer said she walked into the office with her head held high and said, "I want my life back." But it wasn't just legal freedom she wanted. She wanted emotional closure. She needed to believe she could still have the life she dreamed of: a partner, a home, a family. But Burris fought back. He threatened to drag her through court. He demanded financial compensation. He blamed her for his ruined reputation. Karen broke down after one phone call with him. She told a friend, "He took everything, even my will to try again." In the days that followed, Karen returned to Downey and moved into her parents' house. She tried to focus on the positive, decorating her new condo, planning to record again, but those closest to her noticed the change. Her eyes seemed dimmer, her movements slower. Her heart, they now believe, had already begun to fail. In January 1983, Karen entered the studio for what would be her final recording. She sang, now a soft ballad about starting over. Her voice, though weakened, still carried that haunting warmth. The lyrics were almost prophetic. "You are the one who said forever from the start, and I've been drifting since you've gone, out on a lonely sea. But all I need to do is hear your voice, and suddenly I'm free." The engineers said she cried while recording. She knew, on some level, that this might be her final gift. It was. When the autopsy results were released, the world was stunned. Karen Carpenter had died of cardiac arrest due to emetine toxicity, a direct result of her use of ipecac syrup, a drug meant to induce vomiting. Over years of daily use, the toxin had slowly and silently weakened her heart muscles, thinning the walls until her heart simply gave out. She was just 32 years old, 5'5", and barely 80 pounds at the time of her death. But what horrified the medical community wasn't just the cause, It was the missed opportunities. Multiple doctors had seen her in the final years. Therapists, nutritionists, trainers, publicists, even her family. And yet, no one had truly understood the scale of her suffering. In the 1980s, anorexia nervosa was still viewed as a vanity problem, not a deadly illness. Karen wasn't treated as a medical emergency. She was treated like an actress with low self-esteem. Her death changed that almost overnight. Eating disorders were dragged into the spotlight. Hospitals began reclassifying anorexia as a psychiatric and medical condition. Treatment centers were founded. Congress began hearings on body image in media. And most importantly, women across America, especially young girls, finally had a name for the pain they felt. Karen had died, but she had started a movement. In the 1990s, nearly a decade after Karen's death, a box was discovered in storage containing dozens of personal cassette tapes, voice memos, and handwritten letters that Karen had kept hidden. The tapes were raw. Some were recorded during her therapy in New York. Others were audio diaries. In one, her voice trembles. As she says, "People tell me I'm beautiful, but I don't believe them. I look in the mirror and I still see the little girl Mum said needed to lose 5 pounds before the school recital." In another, "I know I'm killing myself, but at least it's something I can control. Everything else, the music, the money, the press, it's all out of my hands." Some recordings were sent to friends but never mailed. Some were just her talking to herself, sobbing between words. They revealed the depth of her pain, her lifelong hunger for love, and her quiet acceptance that she might not survive. To this day, many of these tapes remain unreleased to the public at the request of her family. After Karen's death, public sympathy flooded the Carpenter family. Cards, flowers, tributes, candlelight, vigils. Richard spoke with emotion at the funeral. He vowed to preserve her legacy, eventually compiling Karen Carpenter, A Star on Earth, A Star in Heaven, a tribute that aired years later. But Agnes, she remained distant, cold. To those who knew her, that wasn't surprising. She rarely cried when a fan asked her what Karen would have done next if she had lived. She replied flatly, she would have continued making records with Richard. That was her place. It was as though Karen's death was an inconvenience, not a heartbreak. When Agnes passed away in 1996, her will shocked everyone. She left nothing to Karen's charity or causes related to eating disorders. Not a dollar. She left everything to Richard and other relatives. Karen's name wasn't even mentioned in parts of the document. Many fans and biographers have suggested that Agnes's rigid contraland, lifelong favoritism of Richard played a pivotal role in Karen's emotional breakdown. Whether intentional or not, her inability to emotionally support Karen in life and honor her in death only deepened the wound. Richard Carpenter spent years living in the shadow of his sister's legacy, while he battled his own demons and addiction to Quaalude. In the 1970s, burnout and the collapse of their musical empire, he always admitted that he missed the signs. In interviews, Richard has said, "I thought she was just being vain. I didn't realize she was dying in front of me." He admitted to pressuring her to return to performing when she clearly wasn't ready. He admitted to being dismissive of her solo album, not because it lacked talent, but because it didn't fit the brand. For decades, he carried the guilt. He eventually dedicated much of his life to keeping Karen's memory alive, compiling unreleased recordings, writing memoirs, giving interviews to raise awareness about anorexia. But even in his efforts, he was haunted. In 2011, he told a reporter, "There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about her. I hear her voice everywhere. Sometimes I can't listen to the records anymore. It's just too much." Richard, now in his late 70s, still visits Karen's grave in Downey, still brings flowers, still says, "I'm sorry." Karen's funeral was held on February 8, 1983, at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Cypress, California. The chapel was filled with fans, musicians, producers, and celebrities. Dionne Warwick spoke. Olivia Newton-John sent flowers. Herb Alpert, her longtime mentor, sat silently in the front row, but despite the crowd, many said the service felt hollow. There was no mention of anorexia, no acknowledgement of the cause of death. It was framed as a tragic passing of a beloved daughter. Her music was celebrated, but not her struggle. Her pain was erased from the narrative even in death. Only years later, after fans began demanding transparency, did the full story start to emerge. And by then, it was too late to say the words she had longed to hear while alive. "We see you. We believe you." You were more than your voice. Today, Karen Carpenter's influence is everywhere. Artists like Adele, Sheryl Crow, Madonna, and Christina Aguilera have cited her as a vocal influence. Rolling Stone listed her as one of the greatest singers of all time. Her albums continue to sell worldwide, but it's not just her voice that lives on. It's her story. Her death started conversations in households that had never talked about mental health. It forced the music industry to look at the pressure it places on women. It helped destigmatize eating disorders, and it gave a face to an illness that had previously been ignored. Still, the tragedy remains. Because Karen should have survived, she should have recorded that second solo album, should have remarried someone kind, should have raised kids with her soft humor and wide smile, should have grown older, watching fans sing her songs back to her in arenas, teary-eyed and grateful. But instead, we have her voice, frozen in time, fragile, pure, ghostly, a voice that still breaks hearts because behind every note, we now hear what we missed when she was alive, a plea, a whisper, a girl who was hurting and didn't know how to ask for help. In 1996, 13 years after her death, Karen's solo album was finally released. The lead track, If I Had You, begins with a line that feels like a message from beyond. I wouldn't have to think twice, if I had you. The album was raw, it was honest, it was the voice of a woman finally owning her story. And when fans heard it, they wept not just because it was beautiful, but because it was too late. Karen Carpenter had finally found her voice, but the world wasn't ready to listen until she was already gone. And that, perhaps, is the greatest tragedy of all.